Before we get into today's episode, we want to make something clear right up front. This conversation is built on publicly available information, reported events, and opinion-based analysis. Nothing you're about to hear is presented as absolute fact beyond what has been confirmed. And where there are differing perspectives, we're going to address them openly. The goal here isn't to tell you what to think. It's to give you enough context to question what you're being told elsewhere. As always, this show is about perspective, not perfection. We're going to challenge narratives, call out inconsistencies, and yes, we're going to have some strong opinions along the way. Some of what you hear may hit, some of it may not, but that's the point. This is Data Dissonance, where we don't just repeat the story, we dig into why it's being told the way it is.
Some stories dominate the headlines for days, sometimes weeks. Non-stop coverage, endless panels, breaking news banners, and social media outrage that feels like it never shuts off. And then there are other stories. Stories involving recognizable names, real questions, and legitimate public interest that somehow just fade into the background almost as quickly as they appear. No follow-up, no deep dives, no real pressure, just a quick mention, and then silence. And when you step back and look at that pattern, you start to wonder, is it about what happened or who it happened to? Because we've seen this before. Certain situations get treated like national emergencies, while others, sometimes involving people in positions of power, get handled with kid gloves or not handled at all. And the public notices that, whether the media wants to admit it or not. Trust isn't lost overnight. It erodes slowly, piece by piece, every time something feels selectively covered, selectively framed, or selectively ignored. And right now, we're in a moment where that gap between perception and reality feels wider than it ever has. And here's where it gets complicated, because it's not just about politics, it's about credibility. When the same standards aren't applied across the board, people start questioning everything. Not just the story in front of them, but the system behind it. Who decides what matters? Who decides what gets attention? And more importantly, who decides what doesn't? Because silence can be just as powerful as outrage. Sometimes, even more. So today, we're not just talking about a name or a headline. We're talking about the bigger picture behind it. The pattern, the response, and the question that keeps coming up over and over again. Is accountability still a standard, or has it become optional depending on who you are? All right, let's bring in the crew, because if we're talking about accountability, media silence, and whether the rules still apply the same across the board, I've got just the group to break this one wide open, and probably make it a little uncomfortable in the process. Brian's here, already fired up before we even hit record, probably 3 headlines deep and one step away from calling this the biggest cover-up of the week. Rachel's here, ready to slow things down, add context, and remind us that not everything is as black and white as Brian wants it to be, though I've got a feeling even she might raise an eyebrow or two on this one. Daniel's here, which means at some point we're going to leave the main road entirely and end up connecting dots nobody else even noticed, whether we're ready for it or not. And of course, Skylar's in the mix, ready to push back, challenge the framing, and make sure we're not just running with one side of the story without checking ourselves along the way. And that's exactly what we need for this conversation, because this isn't just about one person or one headline. It's about how stories are handled, how narratives are shaped, and whether the same level of scrutiny actually exists across the board anymore. So we're going to dig into it, question it, probably argue about it, and somewhere in the middle of all that, maybe get a little closer to what's really going on behind the scenes. All right, let's get into this, because this is one of those stories where the reaction feels just as important as the actual situation itself. We're talking about Eric Swalwell, a sitting member of Congress who's no stranger to controversy, no stranger to media attention, and definitely no stranger to calling out others when it comes to issues of accountability, national security, and public trust. But now, once again, his own name is being brought back into the spotlight, And what's interesting isn't just what's being said, it's how quietly it's being handled in comparison to how other figures are treated in similar situations. Because when you look at this from the outside, the question isn't just about the details, it's about the response. There's a noticeable difference in how certain stories are amplified versus how others seem to just exist for a moment and then disappear. And for a lot of people watching this unfold, it raises a pretty uncomfortable question. Are we applying the same standard across the board? Or are some individuals getting a level of protection, intentional or not, that others simply don't get? And if that's the case, what does that say about the broader system people are supposed to trust? Now, to be fair, there are always layers to stories like this. There's what's confirmed, what's alleged, what's politically motivated, and what's simply perception taking over reality. And that's where things can get messy. Because depending on where you're getting your information, you could walk away with two completely different understandings of the exact same situation. And in a media environment like that, consistency becomes everything. If the rules shift depending on who's involved, people notice. And once that trust starts slipping, it's hard to get it back. So Brian, let me start with you on this, because I already know you've got a take locked and loaded. When you look at this situation surrounding Swalwell, is this just another overblown political moment? Or is this part of a bigger pattern where certain figures seem to avoid the level of scrutiny others would absolutely face if the roles were reversed?
Oh, come on, Artie. You already know where I'm going with this, because we've seen this movie 100 times, and somehow people are still pretending it's a brand new script. This isn't about one moment, one headline, or one misunderstanding. This is about a pattern, plain and simple. You've got a sitting member of Congress who has already had serious questions raised in the past involving national security concerns, associations that would have ended just about anyone else's political career overnight. And instead of long-term scrutiny, what did we get? A quick flash of coverage, a few awkward interviews, and then poof, gone. Meanwhile, if this were someone on the other side of the aisle, we'd be looking at wall-to-wall coverage, special reports, congressional hearings, and probably a Netflix documentary by next week. That's not conspiracy, that's observation. And what drives people crazy isn't even just the situation itself. It's the blatant inconsistency in how it's handled. Because you've got guys like Swalwell who have built entire public personas around calling out others, pushing investigations, demanding accountability, and yet when the spotlight swings back on them, everything suddenly gets real quiet, real careful, real, let's move on. That's where trust breaks down. Not because people expect perfection, but because they expect fairness. And right now, fairness feels optional depending on your last name and your party affiliation. So no, this isn't overblown. If anything, it's underplayed, and people are starting to wake up to that.
All right, Brian came in hot, but that's exactly why we start with him. Because whether you agree with the tone or not, he's tapping into something a lot of people are feeling right now. And I think the key word there is consistency. It's not even about demanding perfection from politicians. Nobody expects that anymore. But there is an expectation that the same level of scrutiny applies across the board. Because once people start believing that the rules change depending on who you are, that's when the entire system starts to feel shaky. And whether that perception is completely accurate or not almost doesn't matter at that point, because perception becomes reality for the audience watching it unfold. Now, at the same time, we've got to be careful not to jump straight from frustration to conclusion, because, like we said earlier, there are always layers to these situations. There's what's confirmed, what's contextual, what's been addressed already, and what's getting recycled through headlines for impact. And that's where things can get messy fast, because depending on the source, you could either see this as a major issue being brushed aside, or as something that's already been investigated and resolved, and is now being pulled back into the spotlight for political reasons. And if we're being real, both of those things happen all the time in today's media environment. So Rachel, let me bring you in here, because you're usually the one pulling us back to center when things start leaning too far one direction. When you look at this situation, do you see a legitimate double standard in how it's being covered and talked about? Or is this one of those cases where the story feels bigger than it actually is because of how it's being framed and repeated?
I think there are two things happening at the same time here, and that's why it feels so divided, depending on who you ask. On one hand, Brian's right about perception. There are moments where coverage feels uneven, and when people notice that pattern, it sticks. But on the other hand, with Eric Swalwell specifically, a lot of the most serious concerns that keep resurfacing, particularly the past association with a suspected Chinese intelligence operative, were actually investigated years ago. According to reporting and intelligence briefings that have been publicly discussed, Swalwell was never charged with wrongdoing, and he cut off contact once concerns were raised. That doesn't mean people shouldn't ask questions, but it does change the context from an ongoing scandal to something that has already gone through at least some level of official review. Where I think this gets complicated is how information cycles now. Old stories don't really stay old, they come back, often without the full context attached. And that can make it feel like something new is happening when it's really a continuation of an already known issue. At the same time, the media does play a role in shaping how long something stays in the spotlight. And it's fair to question why some stories get extended attention while others don't. But I'd be careful about jumping straight to the idea that this is being hidden, because in this case, the information is actually out there. It's just not being covered with the same intensity right now. So to me, this is less about a clear-cut double standard and more about how timing, repetition, and framing influence what people think is happening in real time.
And that's why we've got Rachel on the panel, because she just added something that's easy to overlook when the temperature starts rising: context. And whether people like that answer or not, it matters. Because if something has already been looked into, addressed, and closed at an official level, then the conversation shifts. It's no longer just, why isn't this being covered? It becomes, why is this coming back now? And that opens up a completely different lane of discussion, because timing in politics is almost never random. Stories resurface for a reason, and usually, that reason isn't just public interest. It's influence, pressure, or narrative shaping. But here's where I think the tension still lives, because even if something was investigated and technically resolved, that doesn't automatically mean the public feels satisfied with the outcome. Trust in institutions isn't exactly at an all-time high right now. So when people hear, "it was looked into," that doesn't always land the way it used to. For some, that's reassurance. For others, that's where the skepticism actually begins. And that gap between official conclusions and public belief is where a lot of these conversations start to spiral. Because now it's not just about the facts. It's about whether people believe the system handling those facts is actually neutral. And that's exactly where you live, Daniel. So I'm going to hand this one to you, because I already know you're looking at this from a completely different angle. When you see a situation like this, something that's technically in the past but suddenly feels relevant again, do you think this is just the natural cycle of political narratives? Or is there something deeper going on behind the scenes that most people aren't being told?
See, this is exactly where people stop one layer too early, and that's why these situations keep repeating without anyone really understanding the full picture. Because yeah, on the surface, Rachel's right. It was looked into, it was addressed, and officially, that's where the story ends. But politically, narratively, that's where it actually begins. The real question isn't just what happened. It's who benefited from it being handled that way, and who benefits from it coming back now. Because information doesn't just move randomly through the system. It gets pushed, buried, revived, and reframed, depending on what's useful at the time. And when you've got a figure like Eric Swalwell, who sits at the intersection of intelligence conversations, political messaging, and media visibility, you have to at least consider the possibility that this isn't just coincidence. It's timing with purpose.
And here's the part people don't like to sit with.
Sometimes the story itself isn't even the main event. Sometimes it's the reaction to the story that matters more. Watch how different groups respond. Watch what gets emphasized, what gets ignored, and how quickly narratives shift depending on who picks it up. That's where the real signal is. Because if this were truly irrelevant, it wouldn't resurface at all. But if it were truly explosive, it wouldn't be handled this quietly either. So what you're left with is something in the middle, a controlled burn. Enough visibility to keep it in circulation, but not enough pressure to force a real reckoning. And that's not chaos, that's management.
And that right there is why Daniel's dangerous, in a good way. Because he doesn't just look at the headline, he looks at the movement behind it. And whether you agree with that perspective or not, it forces you to ask a different kind of question. Not just what happened, but why are we talking about it again right now? Because timing does matter, especially in politics, especially in media, and especially in an environment where attention is currency. Stories don't just reappear out of nowhere. They get traction because something or someone is pushing them back into the conversation. But I think where this really lands for a lot of people is right in the middle of everything we've said so far. You've got Brian pointing out what feels like inconsistency, Rachel grounding it in context and prior investigation, and Daniel stepping back and questioning the timing and narrative flow. And if you're the average person watching all of this, it's no wonder it feels confusing, because depending on which angle you focus on, you're getting a completely different version of reality. And that's the bigger issue here. Not just this situation, but the fact that people don't feel like they're getting a clear, consistent picture anymore. And once that clarity disappears, trust usually goes with it. So Skylar, let me bring you in here, because you're usually the one calling out when things start leaning too far into assumption or narrative building. When you look at this whole situation, do you see this as a legitimate concern that deserves more attention? Or do you think this is a case of something being stretched, repackaged, and pushed back into the spotlight to serve a political purpose?
I think what's getting lost here is the difference between something being politically useful and something being factually unresolved. And those are not the same thing. When it comes to Eric Swalwell, the most serious claims people keep referencing were investigated years ago, including briefings from intelligence officials. And there was no evidence that he knowingly did anything wrong or compromised national security. That matters, because if we're going to talk about accountability, it has to be based on what can actually be proven, not just what feels suspicious or politically convenient to bring back up. Otherwise, you're not holding people accountable. You're just recycling narratives until they stick. And I'll be honest, a lot of what we're seeing right now feels less like a missed story and more like a strategic re-amplification of something that's already been addressed, especially in a political environment where digging up past associations is one of the easiest ways to discredit someone. That doesn't mean people shouldn't ask questions. It just means we need to be careful about how we frame those questions. Because if every resolved issue can be continuously repackaged as an ongoing scandal, then no one ever actually clears anything, and everything becomes permanent suspicion. And that's a dangerous place to be, not just for one politician, but for the credibility of the entire system.
And that right there is the full spectrum, and honestly, it's exactly why conversations like this matter. Because you just heard 4 completely different ways to look at the same situation, and every one of them carries a piece of the truth. You've got Brian calling out what feels like inconsistency, Rachel grounding it in what's actually been investigated and confirmed, Daniel stepping back and questioning timing and narrative flow, and Skylar drawing a hard line between what's proven and what's being politically recycled. And if you're listening to all of that thinking, so what am I supposed to believe? That's kind of the point. Because in today's environment, it's not just about the facts anymore. It's about how those facts are presented, repeated, and interpreted depending on where you're standing. But here's where I land on it. Regardless of where you fall politically, consistency matters. If something is serious enough to question in one case, it should be serious enough to question in another. And if something has truly been investigated and resolved, then that context needs to be part of the conversation every single time it comes up, not just when it's convenient. Because the moment people start feeling like the rules shift depending on the name attached to the story, that's when trust starts to erode. And once that trust is gone, it doesn't just hurt one side or the other. It affects the entire system, top to bottom. So whether you see this as a resurfaced issue, a political tactic, or a reminder of something that never fully sat right, the bigger takeaway is this. Pay attention to how stories are handled, not just what the stories are. Watch what gets amplified, what gets ignored, and how long something stays in the spotlight. Because sometimes the most important part of the story isn't what's being said, it's what isn't. All right, we're going to take a quick breather, but don't go anywhere, because coming up next, Rachel's got something for you that actually does cut through the noise. And you might want to grab it before it's gone.
All right, before we close this out, quick shift. Because if you're rocking with what we do here, this is how you help keep it going. The Data and Dissonance merch lineup isn't just throwaway stuff. It's built around the mindset of the show. Thinking for yourself, standing your ground, and not just going along with whatever narrative gets pushed that day. And yeah, we've got to talk about the coffee, because it's become a favorite for a reason. High Lakes Light Roast if you want something smooth and easy. Rock Creek Medium for that perfect balance. And Bitterroot Dark French Roast if you like it bold and strong enough to actually wake you up. Whole bean or ground, roasted right here in the US. It's part of the daily routine at this point. We've also got hoodies, hats, mugs, bumper stickers, all the gear that reps the brand and the message behind it. So if you want to support the show and grab something you'll actually use, hit the links in the description and check it out.
You know, what stands out to me after this conversation isn't just the specifics of one story. It's how complicated it's become to even understand what's real, what's resolved, and what's being pushed back into the spotlight for a reason. Because years ago, something like this would have had a clear beginning, middle, and end. It would have been investigated, reported, and eventually settled in the public's mind one way or another. But now, nothing really ends. Stories linger, resurface, evolve, and depending on where you're looking, you're either seeing something that's been handled or something that never truly was. And that's where the real issue sits, not just in politics, but in the environment we're all trying to navigate every day. Because when people can't tell whether something is new, old, exaggerated, or selectively highlighted, it creates this constant sense of uncertainty. And uncertainty leads to doubt. Not just about one story, but about everything. Media, institutions, leadership, you name it. And once that doubt sets in, it doesn't just go away. It builds, quietly, steadily, until people stop trusting the process altogether. Now here's the part that matters, because no matter where you fall on this, whether you think this is overblown, underreported, or somewhere in between, the responsibility doesn't just sit with the people in power. It sits with all of us paying attention. You've got to be willing to look at more than one angle, question what you're hearing, and maybe even sit in that uncomfortable middle ground where things aren't perfectly clear. Because that's where real understanding actually starts, not in certainty, but in questioning. So as you walk away from this one, don't just remember the name or the headline. Remember the pattern. Watch how stories are handled, how long they last, and how they're framed depending on who's involved. Because sometimes the loudest part of the conversation is what never gets said. Remember to speak truth. Stir thought.
This episode is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series, including The Covenant Protocol, The Prophet Directive, and Black Echo Rising. Fast-paced, high-stakes stories that dive into global conflict, hidden agendas, and the kind of truth most people never see coming. And if you're looking for something to listen to after the episode, check out the music. Uncaged for that raw, gritty edge, and Four Wheelers and Hallelujah for a mix of country, faith, and real-life storytelling. All links are in the description. Books, music, and everything else we've got going on.